Hello, welcome everyone to this series of talks produced by Creative Time under the title Living as Form. We at Cooper like Creative Time because their goals and objectives are, just as Cooper Union's, idealistic and radical. Creative Time, and I'm quoting from their beautiful website, commissions, produces and presents art that engages history, breaks new ground, challenges the status quo, and infiltrates the public realm while engaging millions of people in New York City and across the globe. Creative Time is guided by a passionate belief in the power of arts to create inspiring personal experiences as well as foster social progress. Creative Time privileges artists' ideas. They get excited about their dreams and respond to them by providing big opportunities to expand their practices and take bold new risks. They help artists push beyond their comfort levels. In the process, artists engage in a dynamic conversation between sight, audience, and context, offering up new ideas about who an artist is and what art can be, pushing culture into fresh, new directions. Do we still have a mic? In fresh new directions, the artist's temporary interventions into public life promote the democratic use of public space as a place for free and creative expression while reaching people beyond the traditional limitations of class, age, race, and education. Isn't that a beautiful, though a bit long, but beautiful mission statement? So why do I say there is an echo there with our own Cooper Union School of Art mission statement? Because our mission statement says, is to educate artists in the broadest sense, both as creative practitioners engaged with a wide range of disciplines in the visual arts and as enlightened citizens of the world who are prepared to question and transform society. Another part, and that's the last about mission statements, central to the school's philosophy is the advancement of the artist's role in initiating critical responses and alternative models in relation to the prevailing forms and institutions of cultural production. Students are challenged to expand their research and experimentation across the Cooper Union, as well as in surrounding urban environments and in the wider public sphere. So I couldn't think of two institutions better suited to work together, to collaborate. And we did in the past. We often did. You understand that Cooper loves to work with Anne Pasternak, who is here, I hope, tonight. Hi. And with her staff. Tonight, I will be happy to introduce Nato Thompson, who is Chief Curator, and I'll say a few words about his projects. Since January 2007, NATO has organized major projects for Creative Time, such as the Creative Time Summit in 2009 and 2010, which happened here in the Great Hall at Cooper. Paul Ramirez-Jonas's Key to the City in 2010. Jeremy Deller's It Is What It Is with the new museum curators Laura Hopman and Amy Mackey in 2009. Democracy in America, the National Campaign, 2008. Paul Chan's acclaimed Waiting for Godot in New Orleans in 2007. And Mike Nelson's A Psychic Vacuum with curator Peter Ely. Previously, he had worked as curator at Mass MoCA, where he presented numerous large-scale exhibitions, including The Interventionists, that you may remember, subtitled Art in the Social Sphere, 2004, with a catalog distributed by MIT Press. His writings have appeared in publications like Book Forum, Frieze, Art Journal, Art Forum, Parquet Cabinet, and the Journal of Aesthetics and Protest. Is that one journal?
That's one thing.
That's a good journal. The College Art Association awarded him for a distinguished writing in Art Journal in 2004. He curated the exhibition for ICI in 2009, was that? Experimental Geography, with a book available by Melville Housing Publishing, and his book Seeing Power, Socially Engaged Art in the Age of Cultural Production, is coming up in 2012. Okay, Nato, you have the floor, and you have the opportunity to introduce our main speaker tonight, who has spoken before, our esteemed colleague, Claire Bishop, who will be talking to Miriam Ghani, who is also a faculty member in the School of Art. You have the floor.
Thank you, Saskia, and that was totally embarrassing. All that stuff, whatever, so weird. Okay, I did a lot. Thank you, you're awesome. So I want to say a few things. first of all, we want to get right to Claire Bishop, and I'm going to introduce her and Miriam Ghani in conversation at the end. This kicks off a kind of experiment that starts with 3 talks, which is this thing called Living as Form. And then there'll be a big exhibition at the Essex Street Market that kicks off September 23rd of this year, with our 3rd iteration of the Creative Time Summit also kind of starting that off. So it's kind of a carnivalesque moment of social practice. Now, if you think we're beating the dead horse called social practice to the ground over at Creative Time, it's for a good reason. And that is to say, this project is in a sense a cattle call. We have about 25 curatorial advisors from around the world who've submitted 20 projects apiece of social practice projects. This isn't just from visual arts, but urban planning, performing arts, theater, community activism, and also unauthored phenomena writ large. That is to say, it's not an artist that made it, but just stuff's going on. And it's trying to kind of say, hey, what is this cultural moment where people are using the skill sets of culture as a way to produce social change in the world, and thinking about that, emphasizing things of civic participation, participation in general, and all of that as a way to resist power, looking at that work. So that show is the kind of umbrella for what these talks are. There will be also a book put out by MIT Press, which we're quite excited about. I also want to mention that following this talk, we'll have Brian Holmes, who is Mr. Postfortism, as people often like to say, in conversation with Yates McKee. It's here at this site called Postfortism and Culture, June 30th. And then I will give a talk about basically the show and the thinking behind that on August 2nd here. I just want to thank our funders here, Annenberg Foundation, Andrew Mellon, National Endowment for the Arts, the Paneria Foundation, and Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Thanks for giving money to Radical Practice. That's good. Everyone, that's always deserves thank you. Our speaker, Claire Bishop, who's Associate Professor in the PhD program of Art History at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, is still fairly new here in New York, and we are so privileged to have her here. She is brutal in her assessments and skeptical of much, and certainly me, from being California, could use a little of that, with my naive idealism running rampant. But certainly a lot of social practice out of the West Coast with its kind of hippie Portland style. Might need the harsh British attacks that Claire dishes out. And at the end of the day, I suppose we're all after truth, so let's just dish it out and get at it. And Claire is certainly good at that. I'm very excited to have her here because she has a new book coming out, I believe, called Artificial Hells, which is certainly already kind of provocative title. And she's going to talk to some degree. This talk is, I think, about thinking through what are the criteria of a socially engaged art project. She will give a talk for about 45 minutes, and then Miriam Ghani will come up, who's a phenomenal artist who often deals with very intense political subjects like torture, redaction, the war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, such like that, who will kind of ask some questions, and then we open up to you, the audience, to ask some questions that are not too long and self-promotional. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming the phenomenal Claire Bishop.
Thank you, NATO. Oh, God. So you're all expecting brutality. I wonder if I can deliver. No, I've become very mellow since moving to America. So what can I say? Thank you very much for inviting me to be to kick off this series and to make this this lecture, which will be part of a series leading to this important exhibition. I'm sure it'll be a landmark show. Have we got mic problems? Yeah. Like most of NATO's are, which are always hugely stimulating and controversial and disappointing and exciting in equal measure. So a couple of provisos. Then this is not the talk advertised. So it was advertised as something like reconsidering useful art, but Tanya Bruguera requested us not to be using her word. Although I am going to start with a discussion of part of her project, which is also being organised by Creative Time at the moment. So I'm redirecting this to talk about. Oh, we've got a lot of feedback going on here, haven't we? Do I need to talk less loud, less step away from the mic? Didn't happen with you, NATO. Okay, so more close to the mic. Okay. I wonder if it's because I'm wearing a bra and you weren't. So this talk, let's get on to the content, is about participation and spectacle. In response to this question that NATO gave me as like the steering framework for this, is basically where are we at now with social practice? So this also is what I'm trying to do in the conclusion to my book that NATO also kindly mentioned. So this talk, as a result, is a bit of a Frankenstein. It's basically the conclusion to my book, plus some extra bits to flesh out, with some examples so that it doesn't remain too abstract, but I'm aware that it does lurch between the specific and the general. So please bear with me. And I'm also picking up on arguments throughout the rest of the book, which may not make any sense to you, but please just ask during questions and I can flesh this out. So I'm going to start with a few comments about this object of discussion. Where are we today with social practice? Okay, so last month I participated in an event organized by Tanya Bruguera as part of her long-term project, Immigrant Movement International, which is a collaboration between Creative Time and Queen's Museum of Art, based over in Corona. And this day focused on her concept of arte utile, or useful art. 5 artists were invited to present their wares, so to speak, and they offered a good introductory and I think representative cross-section of what's going on at the moment in Europe and the Americas in terms of this thing we call social practice. We've still got this growling feedback, haven't we? Can you tolerate it, or should we fix it before I carry on?
Just carry on, figure it out.
Okay. So one of the first speakers was Rick Lowe, who presented Project Row Houses, a project now in its 17th year to renovate housing in Houston's northern third ward, one of the city's oldest African-American communities. And this community organization has now developed 40 properties and offers a broad program of cultural activities, including art studios and residencies. Then we had Mel Chin discussing his $100 bill project to symbolically raise $300 million, each of which are hand-drawn by participants. You can see him holding one of these dollar bill notes here in the image, and which he's going to use to propose to Congress for an exchange of real dollars in order to deal with lead contamination in New Orleans. Then we had Becca Ekonopoulos from the Brooklyn-based gallery and organization Not an Alternative, who described the group's attempts to intervene in a Kleenex commercial that was being filmed in Manhattan, in which the general public were invited to share their personal Kleenex moments on camera. This is for Kleenex. So the group tried to sabotage this example of participatory marketing by offering sob stories to the camera that culminated in a denunciation of Kleenex's bad environmental record. You can, if you go to Not an Alternative, you can find all these links to their website. Then there was a French couple, Olive Martin and Patrick Bernier, who spoke about their ongoing collaborative project with 2 lawyers, in which they debate the possibility of giving illegal immigrants a legal status by making them into authors. In other words, because authors have more rights in France than immigrants do, would it be legally possible to reposition immigrants as the authors of a site-specific immaterial work? And then finally, Jorge Munguia spoke about Pase Usted, which is a Mexico City-based organization for exchanging ideas and discussion on a range of topics, including ways to make the city more usable and efficient. So these 5 practices showed a cross-section of activities that sought to address and/or realize impact upon society in various ways, through direct action, through symbolic gestures, through consciousness-raising performance, through media intervention, and through the creation of new communities. And all of them involve participation. If it was a kind of key strategy underpinning all of these, it was the idea of participation. So I'm just going to make some observations, things that came to my mind as I was listening to these speakers present their projects. So the first thing that became apparent in this day of events was the lack of vocabulary for really dealing with this work. It could equally be referred to as socially engaged art, community-based art, experimental communities, dialogic art, literal art, interventionist art, participatory art, collaborative art, contextual art, useful art, and the one that we find ourselves using most frequently in North America, but actually not in Europe at all, is social practice. So this latter term seems especially noticeable as art has dropped out of the picture in this particular phrase. Yeah? All the others are a type of art, but social practice is this, is something that doesn't, that seems to have more neutral connotations. And this word practice is presumably intended to connote an ongoing life activity, as in Marxist praxis or Weber's social action, rather than the production of objects. But it also reads, I think, as a possibly self-aggrandizing way to elevate these artistic activities by implicitly comparing them to jobs that are more real and serious, such as law or medicine. Yeah, we sort of a doctor's practice or a legal practice. Of course, there's another, we can put a more positive spin on this as well with the definition that NATO just supplied, where it would denote a kind of interdisciplinary breakdown where the skill sets of culture are being used to promote civic participation. But I'm interested in, why these connotations of social practice as a phrase and why, art seems to have dropped out of that phrase. So the second point that struck me was the importance, indeed the necessity, of having the artist present in person to explain their projects to us, because this type of work resists conventional display. Its emphasis is on process, context, and situation, rather than on the production of an object. So the traditional triad of artist, work of art, viewer is therefore reconceived along the following lines. The artist is conceived less as an individual maker of discrete objects than as a producer of situations. As Jeremy Deller says, and I note, amusingly, NATO's put this on the front cover of the flyer, I don't make things, I make things happen. So then, if you then look at the second term, the work of art as a finite, portable object is reconceived as an ongoing or long-term project. And if you think about the connotations of project, these are also maybe a little scientific, maybe a bit laboratorial, if that's a word. Maybe it's something that has an unclear beginning and an unclear end. And we can track quite clearly the rise of this term project in the 1990s to note this kind of socially engaged work. And then the audience, the kind of third term in this triad, previously conceived as a viewer or a beholder, is now repositioned as a co-producer or a participant. So while these terminological shifts are often more powerful as ideals than as actualized realities, they all aim to place pressure on conventional modes of I feel like this is gone now. No, it's good. It's good, yeah. They all aim to place pressure on the conventional modes of artistic production and consumption, particularly under today's market capitalism. So this poses an important challenge to art history, exhibition making, and spectatorship, which is why I'm so flattered that NATO has asked me to come and speak to this as a way of thinking about how to build up an exhibition around this kind of work. Because the primary audience of participants is usually, with this kind of practice, considered more important than the secondary audience of viewers, i.e. you, me, everyone else who didn't actually participate in the project. So it's no coincidence that curators have concluded that the best mode of exhibition for this work tends to be performative, the discussion panel, the summit, or the congress, as effectively demonstrated not only by the Creative Time Summit, which is now an annual event, but also Tania Bruguera's Useful Art event. So rather than displaying through objects or films or videos these five practices, instead we had to have the artist there speaking, telling us, it's an oral history. So the third point that occurred to me while listening to these presentations was that none of the artists addressed the specifically visual aspects of their work. In other words, their near identical use of digital photography as a mode of documentation. When pushed to address the aesthetics of his practice, this was me in brutal mode asking Mel Chin, where are the aesthetics in your practice? He referred to social harmony, the fact that a landscape without lead pollution would be beautiful. And so it struck me, it seemed to be very telling that this is how he responded to a question about aesthetics, rather than thinking about the method through which his practice is mediated to a subsequent audience. It surprised me as well that none of the artists were interested in this question of mediation, and all seemed to claim or imply that social change was more important. And yet when they were questioned by community organizers and activists about the responsibilities of their respective projects, who, for example, would ensure that the urgent topics raised by these works would be pushed forward into policy change, who would actually be dealing with, taking the lead pollution forward once the money was raised, or taking the removal of lead pollution forward once the money was raised, or who would be pushing through for immigrants' rights in France after this performance had been created. It seemed to me very striking and illuminating to see the artists fall silent. There seemed to be a shortfall on both sides of the art versus social change divide. At best, I think we can imagine a hybrid space that challenges both the expectations of art and those of goal-oriented activism. But more frequently, we seem to be watching social practice as maybe a misleading comfort zone in which the criteria of both art and social change were rejected, but nothing new was stepping in to fill its place. Without the backing of a long-term team to take these issues to the next level and press for policy change, these socially oriented works suddenly seem symbolic, indeed arty, in their lack of focused objective. And that was the thing that was my main take-home point from that day was, my God, these things that I think of as so socially engaged, when they're actually presented to a bunch of community activists, which was what Tanya Bruguera's idea had been, to kind of bring these two constituencies into confrontation, the artists seemed really arty. So then a fourth point, which is a continuation of the third, is that the artists, despite rejecting conventional art world terminology and systems of valorization, nevertheless found their main site of reception and funding within the visual arts. Project Row Houses, for example, is funded inter alia by the Ford Foundation, Continental Airlines and Shell, but also by the NEA, Houston Arts Alliance, the Andy Warhol Foundation. Mel Chin's Wikipedia page tells us that he's the recipient, and I'm quoting, of multiple awards, including the NEA, New York State Council for the Arts, Art Matters, Creative Capital, the Penny McCall, Pollock Krasner, Joan Mitchell, Rockefeller, and Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundations, and the Nancy Grace Foundation Awards. So I'm not saying this to indict these particular two artists, only to observe that an antinomic relationship to visual art is one of the central characteristics of social practice. Claims that participatory social practice stand outside or beyond visual art therefore tend to be disingenuous, since it is institutionally endorsed by visual art institutions. And further signs of this institutionalization can be found in the numerous MFA programs in social practice, mainly on the West Coast. Portland State University, California College of the Arts, Otis, but there's also one in the Carnegie Mellon, which is almost East Coast. And the fact that this genre of work, why is that funny? I come from Europe, it's a very big country. Pittsburgh is, pretty much easy. Okay. And the fact that this genre of work now has its own system of recognition in the form of two prizes, the International Prize for Participatory Art, which is promoted by the Region Emilia-Romagna in Italy, which was inaugurated this year and won by Pablo Helguera, while the recipients of the Leonor Annenberg Prize for Art and Social Change, inaugurated in 2009, include the Yes Men and Rick Lowe. So the fact that this kind of work is backed by organizations like Creative Time is not irrelevant, since they give activist and participatory art an important forum in NYC via the annual Creative Time Summit, as well as through exhibition projects such as Democracy in America and the forthcoming Living as Form exhibition, which this lecture series introduces. Of course, at this point, it's going to be observed that Creative Time's projects are here we go, there's the picture of I should have moved that on earlier. Okay, at this point, it will be observed that Creative Times projects are qualitatively different to the kind of high-profile works offered by its immediate rivals, the Art Production Fund and Public Art Fund, two organizations best known for their huge, spectacular installations around the city that attract large amounts of media coverage and photo opportunities, say, for example, Olafur Eliasson's Waterfalls. The key word here is spectacle, which has been the key term to describe what participatory art opposes itself to, both artistically and politically, since the 1960s. When we examine artists' motivations for turning to social participation as a strategy in their work, one repeatedly encounters the same claim. Contemporary capitalism produces passive subjects with very little agency or empowerment. For many artists and curators on the left, Guy Debord's, oh, hang on, why is that there? Okay, shouldn't be there. Guy Debord's indictment of the alienating and divisive effects of capitalism in the Society of the Spectacle from 1967 strike to the heart of why participation is important as a project. It rehumanizes a society rendered numb and fragmented by the repressive instrumentality of capitalist production. This position, with more or less Marxist overtones, is put forward by most advocates of socially engaged and activist art. Given the market's near total saturation of our image repertoire, so the argument goes, artistic practice can no longer revolve around the construction of objects to be consumed by a passive bystander. Instead, there must be an art of action, interfacing with reality, taking steps, however small, to repair the social bond. As the French philosopher Jacques Rancière points out, the critique of the spectacle often remains the alpha and omega of the politics of art. But what do we really mean by spectacle, especially when we're referring to art as spectacular? Spectacle has a particular, almost unique status within art history and criticism, since it has the incomparable political pedigree, thanks to the Situationist International, and it directly concerns the question of visuality. As frequently used by art historians and critics, especially those associated with October, it denotes a wide range of attributes. For Krauss, writing on the late capitalist museum, it means the absence of a historical positioning and a capitulation to pure presence. For James Meyer, arguing against Olafur Eliasson's Weather Project, it denotes an overwhelming scale that dwarfs viewers and eclipses the human body as a point of reference. For Hal Foster, writing on the Bilbao Guggenheim, it denotes the triumph of corporate branding. For Benjamin Buclot, denouncing Bill Viola, it refers to an uncritical use of new technology. In short, spectacle today connotes a wide range of ideas, from size to scale and sexiness to corporate investment and populism. And yet for Debourg, spectacle doesn't describe the characteristics of a work of art or architecture, but is a definition of social relations under capitalism, but also, importantly as well, it's a definition of social relations under totalitarian regimes. Ooh, why is that blank? Okay. Individual subjects' experience community is atomized and fragmented because social experience is mediated by images, either the diffuse images of consumerism, I think Gursky's 99-cent store image is a perfect example of that, or the concentrated images of the leader, as in totalitarian regimes. As Debourg's film, The Society of the Spectacle from 1971 makes clear, his arguments stem from an anxiety about a nascent consumer culture in the 60s, with its tidal wave of seductive imagery. But the question as to whether or not we still exist in a society of the spectacle was posed by Baudrillard as early as 1981, who dispatched not only Debourg, but also Foucault in his essay, The Procession of Simulacra, and I quote, "We're witnessing the end of perspective and panoptic space, and hence the very abolition of the spectacular. We are no longer in a society of the spectacle, which the Situationists talked about, nor in the specific types of alienation and repression which this implied. The medium itself is no longer identifiable as such, and the merging of the medium and the message, McLuhan, is the first great formula of this new age." More recently, Boris Groys has suggested that in today's culture of self-exhibitionism, via Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, which he provocatively compares to the text-image relationships of conceptual art, we have a spectacle without spectators. And again, I quote, "The artist needs a spectator who can overlook the immeasurable quantity of artistic production and formulate an aesthetic judgment that would single out this particular artist from the mass of other artists. Now, it's obvious that such a spectator does not exist. It could be God, but we've already been informed of the fact that God is dead." End quote. So in other words, I'm rehearsing all of this to make the point that one of the central requirements of art, as opposed to, let's say, creativity, is that it is given to be seen and reflected upon by a spectator. Participatory art, in its strictest sense, forecloses traditional ideas of spectatorship and suggests a new understanding of art without audiences, one in which everyone is a producer. At the same time, the existence of an audience is ineliminable. We are always there, we're always present, since it's impossible for everyone in the world to participate in every project. There is always going to be a secondary audience. So indeed, the dominant narrative of the history of socially engaged Right, so the dominant narrative of the history of socially engaged participatory art across the 20th century is one in which the activation of the audience is positioned against its mythic counterpart, passive spectatorial consumption. Participation thus forms part of a larger narrative that traverses modernity. Art must be directed against contemplation, against spectatorship, against the passivity of the masses paralyzed by the spectacle of modern life. This desire to activate the audience via participatory art is at the same time a drive to emancipate it from a state of alienation induced by the dominant ideological order, be this consumer capitalism, totalitarian socialism, or military dictatorship. Beginning from this premise, participatory art aims to restore and realize a communal, collective space of shared social engagement. But this is achieved in different ways, either through constructivist gestures of social impact, which refute the injustice of the world by proposing an alternative, or through a nihilist redoubling of alienation, which negates the world's injustice and illogicality on its own terms. In both instances, The work seeks to forge a collective, co-authoring, participatory social body, but one does this affirmatively through utopian realization, the other indirectly through what we might call the negation of negation. So for example, and then this is going to be a highly rapid overview, which also doubles as the last lecture to my students at the Graduate Center. So it's, you know, it's very synoptic and fast, but they know what I'm on about. So for example, futurism and constructivism both offer gestures of social impact and the invention of a new public sphere, one geared towards fascism, the other to reinforce a new Bolshevik world order. Shortly after this period, Paris Dada took to the streets in order to reach a wider audience, annexing the social forms of the guided tour and the trial in order to experiment with a more nihilistic type of artistic practice in the public sphere. It's telling that in the first phase of this orientation towards the social, towards using public space as a forum for art, participation has no given political alignment. It's a strategy that can be equally associated with Italian fascism, Bolshevik communism, and an anarchic negation of the political. In the post-war period, we find a similar range of participatory strategies, now more or less tied to leftist politics, and culminating in the theatre of 1968. In Paris, the Situationist International developed alternatives to visual art in the form of the dérive and the constructed situation, while the Groupe Recherche d'Art Visuel, whose image is there here on the right, devised participatory actions, both in the form of installations and street environments. Both of these tend to be rather affirmative in tenor, but exist as a critique of consumer capitalism. Jean-Jacques Labelle's anarchic and eroticized happenings provide a different model, the negation of negation, we might say, in which the audience and performers are further alienated from an already alienating world via disturbing and transgressive activities that aim to produce a group mind or egregore. When these artistic strategies were put into play in different ideological contexts, such as South America or Eastern Europe, the aims and intentions of participation yield different meanings. In Argentina, for example, where a brutal US-backed military dictatorship seized power in 1966, it gave rise to aggressive and fragmented modes of social action, with an emphasis on class antagonism, reification, and alienation, i.e. more negation of negation. In Czechoslovakia, by contrast, brought into line with Soviet normalization after 1968, participatory art had a more escapist tone, with avant-garde actions often masquerading under vernacular forms such as weddings, parties, and festivals, often in remote locations, in order to avoid detection by the secret police. And by the way, I became interested in these after seeing a few images in Studio International from the early 70s, and thinking how much like a work of Jeremy Della this looked like, and I wanted to find out more. So to give another Eastern European example, the work of Collective Actions Group, active in Moscow from 1976 onward, further problematizes contemporary claims that participation is synonymous with collectivism and thus inherently opposed to capitalism. Rather than reinforcing the collectivist dogma of communism, collective action groups deployed participation as a means to create a privatized sphere of individual expression. You know, so in other words, they're trying to forge a space of critical distance, which is also the kind of the space needed for spectacle, which is necessary to the production of spectatorship. So further analogies to contemporary social practice can be found in the rise of the community arts movement after 1968, whose history provides a cautionary tale for today's artists averse to theorizing the artistic value of their work. Emphasizing process rather than end result, and basing their judgments on ethical criteria about whom and about how and with whom they work, rather than on the character of their artistic outcomes, the community arts movement found itself subject to manipulation and eventually instrumentalization by right-wing governments, particularly in the UK. From being an agitational force campaigning for social justice in the early 70s, it became, by the 1980s, a harmless branch of the welfare state, the kindly folk who could be relied upon to mop up wherever the government wished to absolve itself of responsibility. And so we find ourselves today, I was struggling to find a fourth image there that would sum it up, and clearly I just left off the task of thinking about it. A little void. Use your imagination to fill the gap. Yeah? User-generated content in action. So today we find ourselves with an important sector of artists who renounce the vocabularies of contemporary art, claiming to be engaged in more serious worldly and political issues through social practice. Such anti-aesthetic refusals, though, are not new. Just as we've come to recognize Dada, cabaret, situationist détournement, or dematerialized conceptual and performance art as having their own aesthetics of production and circulation, so too do the often formless-looking photo documents of participatory art have their own experiential regime. My point is not to regard these anti-aesthetic phenomena as objects of a new formalism, in other words, kind of dealing with only with the form of reading areas, parades, demonstrations, discussions, ubiquitous plywood platforms, endless photographs of people, but rather to analyze how these contribute to the social and artistic experiences that are being generated. So one of the questions that's continually being posed to me, most recently in Toronto when I spoke at the power plant, is the following. Surely it's better for one art project to improve one person's life than for it not to happen at all. So the history of participatory art, I think, and I never know what to say with this, because when I'm asked that question. So the way to deal with it is to stand back from it and go like, okay, what is that question a symptom of? And I think if we look historically at the different modes of participatory art over the century, this allows us to get critical distance on this question and to see it as the latest instantiation of the ongoing art versus real life debate that has dogged this work since its inception. And this, kind of the art versus real life is just one of several binaries that are attached to this, to the discourse around social practice and participatory art. Another would be a tension between equality and quality, between equality of access to a work of art and the quality of the resulting project. And you can see this tension played out in all the moments at which it arises over the 20th century. Another one is the tension between participation and spectatorship. So the desire to erase or blur the artist-viewer relationship, and then spectatorship being a kind of a situation of having an object of contemplation. So these conflicts between participation and spectatorship, quality and equality, art and real life, indicate that social and artistic judgments don't easily merge. Indeed, they seem to demand different criteria. This impasse seems to surface in every printed debate and panel discussion on participatory and socially engaged art that I've ever attended. For one sector of artists, curators, and critics, a good project appeases a superegoic injunction to ameliorate society. If social agencies have failed, then art is obliged to step in. In this schema, judgments are based on humanist ethics, often inspired by Christianity. What counts is to offer ameliorative solutions, however short-term, rather than the exposure of contradictory social truths. For another sector of artists, critics, and curators, judgments are based on a sensible response to the artist's work. I mean sensible as in, using the senses, both in and beyond the work's original context. In this schema, ethics are nugatory because art is understood continually to throw established systems of value into question, including questions of morality. It's more important to devise new languages with which to represent and question social contradiction. So we could call these the social discourse and the artistic discourse. The social discourse accuses the artistic discourse of amorality and inefficacity because it's insufficient in their eyes merely to reveal, reduplicate, or reflect upon the world. What matters is social change. The artistic discourse, by contrast, accuses the social discourse of remaining stubbornly attached to existing categories and focusing on micro-political gestures at the expense of sensuous immediacy as a potential locus of disalienation. So either social conscience dominates or the rights of the individual to question social conscience. Art's relationship to the social is either underpinned by morality or it's underpinned by freedom. So this binary is echoed in Boltanski and Chiapello's perceptive distinction of the difference between the artistic and social critiques of capitalism. The artistic critique, they argue, is rooted in 19th century bohemianism and draws upon two sources of indignation towards capitalism. On the one hand, disenchantment and inauthenticity, and on the other, oppression. The artistic critique, they explain, foregrounds the loss of meaning, and in particular the loss of the sense of what is beautiful and valuable, which derives from standardization and generalized commodification, affecting not only everyday objects, but also artworks and human beings. Against this state of affairs, the artistic critique advocates the freedom of artists, their rejection of any contamination of aesthetics by ethics, their refusal of any form of subjection in time and space, and in its extreme form, any kind of work. So then they juxtapose that, they compare it to the social critique of capitalism, which draws on different sources of indignation towards capitalism, the egoism of private interests, and the growing poverty of the working classes in a society of unprecedented wealth. This social critique necessarily rejects the moral neutrality, individualism, and egotism of artists. The artistic and the social critique are not directly compatible, Boltanski and Capello warn us, and exist in continual tension with one another. So I find this very illuminating to draw upon these different sources of indignation to capitalism, because I think they map quite nicely onto the ways in which the discourse around social practice is currently staged. So the clash between artistic and social critiques of capitalism recurs most visibly at certain historical moments. And the reappearance of participatory art is always a symptom of this clash. It tends to occur at moments of political transition and upheaval, in the years leading to Italian fascism, in the aftermath of the 1917 revolution, in the widespread social dissent that led to 1968, and its aftermath in the 1970s. At each historical moment, participatory art takes a different form because it seeks to negate different artistic and socio-political objects. In other words, it's got different goals at each historical moment of its appearance. In our own times, its resurgence accompanies the consequence of the collapse of really existing communism in 1989, the apparent absence of a viable left alternative, the emergence of a contemporary post-political consensus, and the near-total marketization of art and education. The paradox of this situation is that participation in the West now has more to do with the populist agendas of neoliberal governments. Even though participatory artists invariably take a stand against neoliberal capitalism, the values that they impute to their work are understood formally in terms of opposing individualism and the commodity object, without recognizing that so many other aspects of this art practice dovetail even more perfectly with neoliberalism's recent forms: networks, mobility, project work, affective labor, and so on. But I'm going to return to this misleading equation between kind of forms of a work of art and forms in society in about 15 minutes. So as this ground has shifted over the course of the 20th century, so the identity of participants has been reimagined at each historical moment, from a crowd in the 1910s to the masses in the 1920s, to the people in the late 60s and early 70s, to the excluded in the 1980s, to community in the 1990s, to today's volunteers whose participation is continuous with a culture of reality television and social networking. From the audience's perspective, we can also chart this as a shift from an audience that, the audience that demands a role, expressed as his hostility towards avant-garde artists who keep control of the proscenium. So the Futurist serrate would be and Dada cabaret would be the example of this. The idea of participants demanding a role, to an audience that enjoys its subordination to strange experiences devised for them by an artist, whether it's licking jam off the hood of a car, in the case of this Capra, to an audience that is encouraged to be the co-producer of a work of art, and who occasionally can even get paid for this involvement. This could be seen as a heroic narrative of the increased activation and agency of the audience, but we might also see it as a story of their ever-increasing voluntary subordination to the artist's will, and of the commodification of human bodies in a service economy, since voluntary participation is also unpaid labor. So arguably, this is a story that runs in parallel with the rocky fate of democracy itself, a term to which participation has always been wedded, from a demand for acknowledgement to representation to the consensual consumption of one's own image, be this in a work of art, YouTube, Flickr, or reality television. Consider the media profile according to Anthony Gormley's One and Other from 2009, a project to allow members of the public to continuously occupy the empty fourth plinth of Trafalgar Square in London, 1 hour at a time for 100 days. Gormley received 34,520 applications for 2,400 places, and the activities of the plinth's occupants were continually streamed online. Here's an example of some of these people. So although the artist referred to one another as an open space, and I quote, an open space of possibility for many to test their sense of self and how they might communicate this to a wider world, end quote, the project was described by the Guardian, not unfairly, as Twitter art. In a world where everyone can air their views to everyone, we're faced, I think, today not with mass empowerment, but with an endless stream of banal egos. Far from being oppositional to spectacle, participation has now entirely merged with it. And then the latest example of this, of course, arrived in my inbox via eFlux this week with John Baldessari's Your Name in Lights, which comes with the most appalling hyperbole in the announcement. I mean, it's unfair to make a dig at press announcements, but really this one is priceless. So each registered name will be illuminated for 15 seconds on the 30-meter-long LED sign that will be on view 24 hours a day during the exhibition. This is going to be at the Stedelijk in Amsterdam. Warhol is so yesterday, says Baldessari. Be a celebrity for 15 seconds. Be a celebrity, a living legend and an idol. Experience the thrill of seeing your name in lights. And Anne Goldstein, director of the Stedelijk, remarked, after its hugely successful premiere in Sydney, we're thrilled and honoured to have the opportunity to present this work in Amsterdam. Ever precocious, Baldessari invites us to participate in a work that not only gives each of us a moment of individual celebrity, but also an impression of our diversity and community. So this... I think maybe I'll go back to this one, because I like this pairing a lot of Gormley with Simon Cowell. So this new proximity between spectacle and participation underlines for me the necessity of sustaining a tension between artistic and social critiques. The most striking projects that constitute the history of participatory art unseat all of the polarities on which this discourse is founded: individual versus collective, author versus spectator, active versus passive, real life versus art, but not with the goal of collapsing them. In so doing, they hold the artistic and social critiques in tension, and I'm aware that this is very abstract. I'm going to get on to a concrete example in a minute. Felix Guattari's paradigm of transversality offers one such way of thinking, reaffirming art as a universe of value. Jacques Rancière offers another. The aesthetic regime is constitutively contradictory, shuttling between autonomy and heteronomy. He argues that in art, theatre, and education alike, there needs to be a mediating object, a spectacle that stands between the idea of the artist and the feeling and interpretation of the spectator. And I quote, this spectacle is the third thing to which both parts can refer, i.e. both parts being the artist and the audience, can refer, but which prevents any kind of equal or undistorted transmission. It is a mediation between them. The same thing which links them must separate them. This is part of a kind of a much larger argument that he makes in the Emancipated Spectator. So in different ways, Rancière and Guattari offer alternative frameworks for rethinking the artistic and social simultaneously. For both, art and the social are not to be reconciled or collapsed, but to be sustained in continual tension. So I'm interested in these theoretical models drawn from continental philosophy because they don't reduce art to a question of ethically good or bad examples, nor do they forge a straightforward equation between forms of democracy in art and forms of democracy in society. Most of the contemporary discourse on participatory art and social practice implies an evaluative schema akin to that laid out in the classic diagram, The Ladder of Participation, which was published in an architectural journal in 1969 to accompany a feature about forms of citizen involvement. The ladder has 8 rungs, as you can see. The bottom 2 indicate the least participatory forms of civic engagement, the non-participation of mere presence in manipulation and therapy. The next 3 rungs are degrees of tokenism, informing, consultation, and placation, which gradually increase the intention paid by power to the everyday voice. At the top of the ladder, we find partnership, delegated power, and the ultimate goal, citizen control. The diagram provides a useful set of distinctions for thinking about the claims to participation made by those in power, and is frequently cited by architects and planners. It's tempting to make an equation, and many have done so, between the value of a work of art and the degree of participation it involves, turning the ladder of participation into a gauge for measuring the efficacy of an artistic practice. But while the ladder provides us with helpful and nuanced differences between forms of civic participation, I think it falls short of corresponding to the complexity of artistic gestures. The most challenging projects don't follow this schema because models of democracy in art do not have an intrinsic relationship to models of democracy in society. The equation is misleading and doesn't recognize art's ability to generate other, more paradoxical criteria. So some of the works that I discuss in my book and some of the things I flicked over too rapidly 5 minutes ago don't offer anything like citizen control. The artist relies upon the participant's creative exploitation of the situation that he or she offers, just as participants require the artist's cue and direction. This relationship is a continual play of mutual tension, recognition, and dependency, more akin to the collectively negotiated dynamic of stand-up comedy or to BDSM sex than to a ladder of progressively more virtuous political forms. So a case study, now 11 years old, illustrates this argument, I think, that art is both grounded in and suspends reality, and does this via a mediating object or third term. And this work is called Pleaselet Austria from 2000, devised and largely performed by the German filmmaker and artist Christoph Schlingensief, who sadly died last summer, but is representing Germany in Venice next month. So commissioned to produce a work for the Wiener Festwochen, Schlingensief chose to respond directly to the recent electoral success of the far-right Nationalist Party, led by Jörg Haider, the FPO. The FPO's campaign had included overtly xenophobic slogans and the word Überfremdung, domination by foreign influences, once employed by the Nazis to describe a country overrun with foreigners. Schlingensief erected a shipping container outside the Opera House in the center of Vienna, topped with a large banner bearing the phrase Ausländer raus, foreigners out. In the container, Big Brother-style living accommodation was installed for a group of asylum seekers relocated from a detention center outside the city. Their activities were broadcast through the internet television station webfreetv.com, and via this station, viewers could vote daily for the ejection of their least favorite refugee. At 8 p.m. each day, for 6 days, the two most unpopular inhabitants were sent back to the deportation center. The winner was purportedly offered a cash prize and the prospect, depending on the availability of volunteers, of Austrian citizenship through marriage. The event is documented by the Austrian filmmaker Powell Poet in an evocative and compelling 90-minute film, Ausländer raus, Schlingensief's Container. Have we got time for a 5-minute clip of this? No. I've got 3 minutes. I can have a 3-minute clip, or I've got 3 minutes left. Okay, bye. Okay, so Pleaselet Austria is typical Schlingensief in its desire to antagonize the public and stage provocation. His early film work frequently alluded to contemporary taboos, mixing Nazism, obscenities, disabilities, and assorted sexual perversions in films like German Chainsaw Massacre and Terror 2000, once described as filth for intellectuals. In the late 1990s, Schlingensief began making interventions into public space, including the formation of a political party, Chance 2000, targeted at the unemployed, disabled, and other recipients of welfare, with the slogan, "Vote for yourself." Chance 2000 didn't hesitate to use the image of Schlingensief's long-term collaborators, many of whom have mental and/or physical handicaps. Yeah, you can see some of them down here. But in Pleaselet Austria, Schlingensief's refugee participants were barely visible, disguised in assorted hats, wigs, and sunglasses. In the square, the public had only a limited view of the immigrants through peepholes. The bulk of the performance was undertaken by Schlingensief himself, installed on the container's roof beneath the Foreigners Out banner. Speaking through a megaphone, he incited the FBO to come and remove the banner, which they didn't do. He encouraged tourists to take photographs, invited the public to air their views, and made contradictory claims, such as, "This is a performance, this is the absolute truth," while all the while parroting the most racist opinions and insults back to the crowd. As the various participants were evicted, Schlingensief provided a running commentary to the mob below. "It's a black man. Once again, Austria has evicted a darkie." Although in retrospect, and particularly in Poet's film, it's evident that the work is a critique of xenophobia in its institutions, in Vienna, the event, and Schlingensief's charismatic role as circus master, was ambiguous enough to receive approval and condemnation from all sides of the political spectrum. An elderly right-wing gentleman, this guy, covered in medals, gleefully found it to be in sympathy with his own ideas, while others claimed that by staging such a shameful spectacle, Schlingensief himself was a dirty foreigner who ought to be deported. Left-wing student activists attempted to sabotage the container and liberate the refugees, while assorted left-wing celebrities showed up to support the project, including Daniel Cohn-Bendit, a key figure from May '68, and the laureate author Elfriede Jelinek, who wrote and performed a puppet play with asylum seekers. In addition, large numbers of the public watched the program on webfreetv.com and voted for the eviction of particular refugees. The container prompted arguments and discussion in the square surrounding it, in the print media, and on national television. The vehemence of response is palpable through the film, no more so than when Poet's camera pans back from a heated argument to reveal the entire square full of agitated people in debate. One elderly woman, this woman here, was so infuriated by the project that she could only spit at Schlingensief the insult, "You artist." So a frequently heard criticism of this work is that it didn't change anyone's opinion. The right-wing pensioner is still right-wing, the lefty protesters are still lefty, and so on. But this instrumentalized approach to critical judgment misunderstands the artistic force of Schlingensief's intervention. The point is not about conversion, for this reduces the work of art to a question of propaganda. Rather, Schlingensief's project draws attention to the contradictions of political discourse in Austria at that moment. The shocking fact is that Schlingensief's container caused more public agitation and distress than the presence of a real deportation center a few miles outside Vienna. The disturbing lesson of Pleaselet Austria is that an artistic representation of detention has more power to attract dissenters than an actual institution of detention. In fact, Schlingensief's model of undemocratic behavior corresponds precisely to democracy as practiced in reality in Austria. This contradiction is the core, I think, of Schlingensief's artistic efficacy, and it's the reason why political conversion is not the primary goal of a work of art, why artistic representations continue to have a potency that can be harnessed to disruptive ends, and why Pleaselet Austria is not and should never be seen as morally exemplary. So in his essay, The Uses of Democracy, from 1992, Jacques Rancière notes that participation in what we normally refer to as democratic regimes is usually reduced to a question of filling up the spaces left empty by power. Genuine participation, he argues, is something different, the invention of an unpredictable subject who momentarily occupies the street, the factory, or the museum, rather than a fixed space of allocated participation whose counterpower is dependent on the dominant order. Setting aside this problematic idea of genuine participation versus false participation, which takes us back to modernist oppositions between authentic and false culture, such a statement clearly pertains to Pleaselet Austria and to the better examples of social practice, which have frequently constituted a critique of participatory art, rather than upholding an unproblematized equation between artistic and political inclusion. The fact that the ladder of participation culminates in citizen control is worth recalling here. At a certain point, art has to hand over to other institutions if social change is to be achieved. It's not enough to keep producing activist art. The historic avant-garde was always positioned in relation to an existing party politics, primarily communist, which removed the pressure of art ever being required to effectuate change in and of itself. Later, the post-war avant-gardes claimed open-endedness as a radical refusal of organized politics, be this interwar totalitarianism or the dogma of a party line. There was the potential, and I'm referring in the 50s and 60s, to discover the highest artistic intensity in the everyday and the banal, which would serve a larger project of equality and anti-elitism. Since the 1990s, participatory art has often asserted a connection between user-generated content and democracy, but the frequent predictability of its results seems to be the consequence of it lacking both a social and an artistic target. In other words, participatory art today stands without a relation to an existing political project, is only aligned with a loosely defined anti-capitalism, and it presents itself as oppositional to visual art by trying to sidestep the question of visuality. As a consequence, these artists have internalized a huge amount of pressure to bear the burden of devising new models of social and political organization, a task that artists are not always best equipped to undertake. My point, again, is not to criticize specific artists, but to see the whole rise of social practice since 1989 as symptomatic. That the political and the critical have become the shibboleths of advanced art signals, I think, two things. It signals a lack of faith both in the intrinsic value of art as a de-alienating human endeavor, since art today is so intertwined with market systems globally, and it also signals a lack of faith in democratic political processes, in whose name so many injustices and barbarities are conducted. But rather than addressing this loss of faith by collapsing art and ethics together, the task today is to produce a viable international alignment of leftist political movements and a reassertion of art's inventive forms of negation as valuable in their own right. We need to recognize art as a form of experimental activity overlapping with the world, whose negativity may lend support towards a political project without bearing the sole responsibility for devising and implementing this. And, more radically, we need to support the progressive transformation of existing institutions through the transversal encroachment of ideas whose boldness is related to, and at times may be greater than, that of an artistic imagination. And with this, it comes to mind the Antanas Mokas talk that was part of the Festival of Ideas a couple of weeks ago. This is the former mayor of Bogota, who was implementing what he called sub-art activities in Bogota as a means of changing the mode of conduct and behavior and the kind of promotion of environmental improvements in the city of Bogota. So to conclude, by using people as a medium, participatory art has always had a double ontological status. It is both an event in the world and at one removed from it. As such, it has the capacity to communicate on two levels, to participants and to spectators, the paradoxes that are repressed in everyday discourse, and to elicit perverse, disturbing, and pleasurable experiences that enlarge our capacity to imagine the world and our relations anew. But to reach this second level requires a mediating third term, an object, an image, a story, a film, even a spectacle, that permits this experience to have a purchase on the public imaginary. Participatory art is not a privileged political medium, nor a ready-made solution to a society of the spectacle, but is as uncertain and precarious as democracy itself. Neither are legitimated in advance, but need continually to be performed and tested in every specific context. Thank you.
So I guess we're going to have, Miriam, you can come up, and we're going to have them, Miriam Ghani and Claire in conversation. And then we'll think about some questions. There's a lot there.
Is that on?
Are they
Is that
both
amplified?
on?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Claire, for a very provocative talk. And thanks, NATO and Creative Time, for inviting me to respond to it. I'm honored. Okay, so I had the privilege of actually reading the chapter on which this talk was based, so I have a little bit of extra knowledge to back up my questions, and I'm going to take full advantage of it.
This is when it feels like an exam.
Sorry, Claire. Okay. Let's see, where should we start? Right. Okay, well, given what NATO just told us about the format of Living as Form, which is going to present a whole continuum of social practice, what do social practices gain or lose by entering or being understood as art, entering the space of art or being understood as art?
Well, I think it's not so much what do they gain, because I think, like it or not, they are functioning within the space of art, and they're functioning more there than they are most of the time within, let's call it the real world out there, although I hate that division. So then it's a question of, like, what kind of, how effective can that visibility be in communicating these activities to a secondary audience, to the rest of us who weren't present at the place and time where these projects were taking place. What else they gain is some kind of historical posterity, because I think there's a tendency for this work to exist, to be so focused on the pure presentness of the activities that it's engaged with and the communities or constituencies that it's working with, that it tends to fall out of historical narrative. And certainly the book I've written is focusing on a whole history of stuff that has Situations International aside, is largely fallen out of the mainstream canon of art history. And therefore, it's access to a cultural imaginary is also foreclosed when that question of its posterity, or what kind of what it can leave in its wake, and what information it can offer to subsequent audiences, artists, thinkers. Yeah, I mean these are the I think this question of history is the one that I think is an important one that's often overlooked in relationship to this kind of practice. How do we historicize it? Otherwise, the market narrative of contemporary art will be the one that triumphs, and that's not the one that I want to see representing what happened in art over the last 20 years.
Another thing is this idea of the importance of contradictions, or the ability of art to hold contradiction, paradox, and tension within itself, and how that might translate or be loaned to social practices that don't necessarily call themselves art, but when they enter into the space of art, might they be able to join in this ability to hold all these different binaries that you brought out in your talk, the binary between participation, spectatorship, equality, quality, art, real life, morality, freedom, social and the artistic, the ethical and the aesthetic, the sacrificial and the sensible, the process and the product, the individual and the collective, the author and the spectator.
God.
My God, there were a lot of binaries in that talk.
Yeah, but you're drawing on other pieces I've written there as well. I didn't mention sacrifice once.
Okay. But if you're suggesting, as you did in the talk, that these binaries can be, rather than being held in opposition, being understood as binaries, and rather than being collapsed, they can actually be held in a continual tension or contradiction or paradox. How is that useful?
How is that useful? That's a very stacked question. How is it useful to what or to whom?
Okay, granted. How?
I mean, my point is more about criteria and kind of an evaluation, and how do we, what are the criteria that we collectively bring to these projects in order to establish whether one is more interesting or vivid or useful, if that's a key word. What are the values that we're bringing to this stuff? So I'm not doing this in order to kind of produce a canon, but in order to think through something that is a type of practice that is often not reflected upon because it is seen as being, it has good intentions, therefore it's good and we should support it. And I think it should be subject to, it can be subject to more critical probing than that. And so for me, one of the, my criteria that I would bring to a good example of social practice or a participatory project is this ability to kind of to hold these kind of binaries in a dialectical tension, and to and where was I going with that? There's kind of to be doing what is what the humanities are very good at, which is to be kind of contradictory, paradoxical, to be not be reducible to quantitative statistical analysis or numerical verification. And so I'm interested in kinds of work that move outside of a kind of this requirement that is so frequently found in Europe now, especially in the Netherlands and in the UK, whereby art is subject to a kind of statistical evaluation of who its audience is and how it's being used and what economic impact can be generated from this kind of work.
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit before the talk, but the instrumentalization of socially engaged art is something you've talked about in other, not so much today in this talk, but you've talked about this in other spaces, and we talked about it a little bit beforehand. Do you want to expand on that a bit? How you see that progressing? We've talked about how it's happening a bit more in Europe than in the U.S. And I mentioned how I see it starting to become an issue in the Middle East, which is more of a new thing. But
yeah, sure. So one of the motivating reasons for doing this research and writing this book was a sense of unease at the way in which socially engaged art was being instrumentalized by the UK government through public funding. And of course now we're in a very bleak situation of a liberal conservative coalition which is just straightforwardly cutting funding for the arts, so it's arguably even worse. So my unease is that kind of a set of ideas which are with which one is in broad agreement, such as increased accessibility and increasing the types of audiences and constituencies that have access to art and to the production of art, was being done through the imposition of funding policies that prioritized certain kinds of work, and participatory work was the privileged medium in that regard. That was the one seen that there's some kind of by being manual and being hands-on and being physically involving people, that it was somehow more direct and authentic way to engage people than via the process of thinking about a film or a video or a photograph or any other kind of performance or any other kind of artistic mode that we can think of. So it's this question of kind of the way in which, and this is kind of what the last few paragraphs of the lecture were about, was the kind of trying to dismantle this idea of participatory art as a privileged medium in relationship to any form of politics, be this kind of an ostensibly benign cultural policy, as we see happening in the UK, but which is equally geared towards creative cities and the creative industries. These things blur into each other. I'm rambling. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well,
maybe, but I'm curious to hear more about how you feel it's being instrumentalized in the Middle East, because I assume it's not being done through cultural policy, but through particular institutions.
Yeah, mostly through particular institutions. I think most people are aware of what's just happened with the Sharjah Biennial, And the Sharjah Biennial is a really interesting example of a sort of state of exception, a cultural state of exception that was created and enabled a certain kind of subversive politics to exist solely within a space of art enabled by a particular institution. But as we discussed, it only worked as long as no one looked at it. So it only worked as long as no one in the Emirati power structure actually looked at the work. And as soon as somebody actually looked at the work, the space of the biennial was completely closed down. And that created all the problems that you mostly have probably heard about, where the director was fired, a work was censored, and now there's a sort of PR battle going on between the people who have quit and the people who are still running the institution, trying to decide, to say how much work was censored, to what degree, how many pieces, and so on and so forth. And there's a real question as to whether this biennial will continue or not, and in what form it will continue, and how much it will be able to continue providing this particular space.
How would you say, I'm just going to return, turn the tables here and just keep asking my own
Go ahead.
questions. So how would you say art is being instrumentalized in that instance?
Well, in the sense that a kind of, it's almost like a play is staged within this particular reserved space, where a whole series of positions which are and were very subversive in relation to the larger, more repressive society in which they were being exhibited were able to be created. A lot of them were actually commissioned by the biennial, these works that were quite subversive. And those works would never have, many of those works would not have been made without the support of the biennial. And a lot of them were made by artists from other parts of the Middle East, where they had even less possibility to make those kinds of works. However, the play that was staged was the sort of the fiction that these works were made in relationship to the place where they were being shown, that they were made in relationship to the Emirates, and that they were having an effect on the Emirates. Yeah. That, I think, was proved to be sort of a fiction by what just happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is that the first real reaction by the citizens of Sharjah to a work in the biennial resulted in it being censored and removed from the biennial. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so it's the use of presentation language.
Okay, so is it my turn to ask another
give me
question
another
now?
exam question. I've been doing orals exams all year for PhD students, and now I feel like this is mine in public.
Actually, speaking of the biennial, there was a work in that was a Khalil Rab, a piece that was called "Everyone in Palestine is an Artist," which actually was very similar to one of those 5 projects presented at
Really?
Tanya Bruguera's piece, and that it was based on this idea that since artists have more freedom to move within Israel, that if everyone in Palestine becomes an artist, similar to, exactly, this idea of French immigrants. Okay. Okay. Is art only effective as a negative or nihilist project?
That's another setup question. We need to kind of immediately go for effective, and
Right.
what kind of effective do you mean? Do you mean a kind of achieving demonstrable outcomes in the world, like policy change, or effective effective artistically in terms of its capacity for igniting the imagination and effectual responses?
Well, how would you define effectiveness?
I'm more inclined towards the latter, because I think that's what art does better.
And can that only be achieved negatively or nihilistically?
No, you can do it. Like, I'm not good. This is why I've softened since I came to New York. There are multiple modes of doing this, and this is what I kind of try to do by like laying out these 2 modes, through a kind of, one takes a more affirmative, direct route, and the other one will be more oblique and operate through what I call the negation of negation, by producing, nihilistic, alienating experiences as a critique of alienation.
And does one produce new formal languages and the other produce new social or political models?
No, it doesn't fall that easily into into these two camps. I'm just saying that these are the two dominant modes through which social engagement has taken place over the course of the 20th century. But of course, like there are good and bad examples in both, through both methods.
Okay. One thing that struck me when you were quoting Rassière on participation and these spaces of participation that are sort of predetermined by what is left open by power, was that in certain kinds of participatory projects, you might say that the artist is the holder of power and is creating these spaces of participation, which are the only spaces left open by what the artist, as the power holder,
For sure,
does.
Yeah. But I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, and we need to be realistic about that. I mean, it has exact parallels with, let's say, kind of a critical pedagogy, like whether you can entirely erase the teacher-student relationship and pretend that it doesn't exist, or whether you deal with that in a more kind of productive, realistic way by reducing. So it would be the distinction that Freire makes between authority and authoritarianism. And this is something I think, kind of for sure, the artist is the kind of the sovereign director of the space of the work of art, and will always create the place, the allocation. But it's not about black and white. This is the kind of the artist, allowing people to participate or not, or being actually very structured in the way in which they participate. It's more about understanding all of these shades of gray, and that this is a mutually negotiated tension. That's why I make this comparison to, well, the only two things I can think of, I'm sure there's loads more examples, but I do think, BDSM sex is one of these kind of negotiated spaces, and also stand-up comedy, where, the stand-up comedian is nothing without the audience and the relay back from the audience telling whether they're, how they're doing and whether they're carrying on or not. And this kind of relationship between the artist and the participant, I think, is exactly this kind of negotiated space of tension. So to see it as a ladder, I think, is misleading. This ladder leading to the holy grail of citizen control. It doesn't happen within a work of art. Audience.
The green light's on. Thanks, guys. I'm just going to take some questions from the audience at this point, too. But since I got the mic, I'm just going to say one thing real quick. With your analysis, Claire, can you, how do you see this, take your analysis and then undergird it with, like, political economy, right? Which is to say, because I suspect that people would say, yeah, these spaces you're talking about, I guess the question is, where is art possible? Because there might be those that say, it's not possible in the spaces reserved for museums, for art. That thing you want cannot any longer happen in the spaces that art is supposed to happen in. So where can art happen? Because I think what we find is there's a kind of lack of faith that art, that experience you're talking about, is possible. And that these structural approaches that are more ethical are maybe an attempt to produce a space where that thing you want to happen can happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I understand you.
Because otherwise it reduces to spectacle. You would say, this is this transgressive moment, but maybe it's just spectacle.
You misunderstand me if you think I'm advocating stuff that goes in museums.
No, I don't. But I'm wondering, where does it happen?
Well, it happens everywhere, and the history of art over the, even from the mid-19th century shows us that it happens everywhere. And that's why I wonder if there's too much emphasis placed on it happening in particular places. And of course, I think it's so hard to generalize. That's what my last sentence of this is about. You need to take each specific instance and see, its meaning is determined contextually according to, what are the connotations of these forms at these particular times and places. In our culture, what does it mean to be doing this kind of work? What is it a symptom of? And
but Claire, does the end of your argument suggest that socially engaged art needs to align itself more precisely with political movements? Or
and with the proviso that we need a political
movement
movement
an
in the
actual
first
political
place.
movement that we can align ourselves with.
Then there needs actually to be the kind of the there needs to be like some kind of left imaginary in the States that that exists outside academia and the art world. But yeah, I mean, I think, but there's so much, I feel so intensely in all the kind of discussions around this kind of work and at the Creative Times Summit, this kind of pressure for artists to be coming up with solutions and models. And it's, and it's a very interesting historical moment because that pressure hasn't existed before. And so it tells us something about our relationship to art on the one hand and our relationship to politics on the other.
Thank you very much for that was a great talk, and I was actually really struck by how you ended the talk and asking essentially what is it that an artist does best, and then thinking about that in collaboration with politics, not in like the collaborative space of the practice, but rather in more like some kind of larger shared goal. But before that, when you were talking about instrumentalization, at the end of your talk, when you started talking about that, I was wondering if, and perhaps because I've read some of your earlier, more confrontational work, that I was wondering if, which is great, but I was wondering, I got the feeling that at some point I could hear you saying something like these kinds of socially engaged practices are always instrumentalized. Or
Sorry.
When are they ever not instrumentalized? And then I was thinking, actually I think that there might be two different kinds of instrumentalization in your talk, and I wasn't really sure if you've, if they're separate or if I'm like mixing things up, because it seems at one level there's the subordination of the aesthetic to some kind of social goal in an artistic practice.
Yeah.
Right? And that's one level of instrumentalization. Yeah. But then there's also, it seems like, a level of instrumentalization that happens by the state depoliticizing a certain kind of art. So.
Yeah, no, that's very astute, yeah.
I didn't mean to, I'm just trying to keep this moving. Go ahead.
No, I think you're right. There are two levels, and that's very astute. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, you're right. I don't.
Practice that leads to the state.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's.
There's some kind of special connection versus other kinds of aesthetic practices.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I find troubling is that the criteria become very similar, and appeals are made to the same criteria, despite having very different goals in mind. And that overlap is something that, is something that perturbs me. And I think that because if activist-oriented artists are insistent upon seeing their work in terms of concrete goals and outcomes, and yet, as we saw with the Useful Art Day, actually, it's actually quite limited in terms of how far those are taken in some cases. Then this feeds in very nicely to the desire of cultural policy organizations by the state to instrumentalize these practices for the larger agenda, such as the social inclusion agenda in Europe. Sorry, I'm not being very articulate.
Make another question here. Oh, okay. You're far
I'm being
back
really
there.
repetitious.
Thanks. I wanted to talk a little bit about your perception of Mel Chin's work at the Useful Art Day, because I love this quote here. Changing from being an artist who makes things to being one who makes things happen. And the beauty to me of Mel's work, the $100 bill project has about 50 different layers to it. But the ultimate beauty for me is that he's making the EPA, the federal government, who's in charge of environmental issues, take responsibility for the lead poisoning. And that, to me, is a very beautiful outcome, and more beautiful than what the landscape looks like, et cetera. But he's embarrassing the government into making these kinds of leaps where they actually take responsibility for what they're supposed to be paying attention to. And that, to me, is a really substantial part of that project. And probably in a cursory presentation where you get caught up in the $100 bills, you don't see the final outcome. But to me, that's the beauty of the project. And if he can make those public officials do their job, that's a beautiful thing.
Do I want to say something? No, I mean, only in that it's striking when I was doing the kind of the recap, which ones made people laugh. And it's funny that, you know, there's a kind of pleasure maybe in certain kinds of intervention. I mean, and not, for example, the Mel Chin one, but when I described the lawyers or I can't remember, the Kleenex one, you know, like, so but I think we need to think about what kind of pleasure is offered by that kind of intervention, and to think about that so that we're getting out of this instrumentalized, here's the outcome of this, and isn't it all worthy, and we're all, you know, just kind of there in our hair shirts wanting worthy art, but instead to get to acknowledge the kind of, the deviant pleasures of some of these pieces, and to be able to find a language to describe them. Although, I mean, I have to disagree with you, I don't particularly like Mel Chin's project, but all the same. But I appreciate what you're saying about the... Yeah. I don't want to get into an argument about specifics, but just like the point is about affectual responses and how do we start accounting for them in relationship to this kind of practice.
Okay, do you got another question in here? Anybody? Okay, you. Oh, you're really in the middle.
You said something that sounded like these projects need a mediating, iconic image to have impact, to have memory in the public imaginary. And that kind of strikes what I see as an undercurrent in your work of a ambivalent longing for attention to the aesthetic. And I was wondering if you could address that. You keep coming around, you kind of around the edge, and it sounds like the aesthetic is really a absolutely verboten topic regarding this work, and you're trying to kind of covertly bring it back in and say that the visual ambiguity, the suggestiveness, even the beauty of some images are why we remember these social practices. Could you comment on that?
Partly. Okay, I mean, I want to just be precise here, that it's not about the iconic, but it could equally be a story, a narrative, an idea. These things can be dematerialized, just in the same way that, you know, certain conceptual art gestures or performance art works from the 60s and 70s capture our imagination despite having a very bad, crappy image. Yeah, so I want to start paying attention to the kind of the affectual responses that we have, and to kind of be able to, you know, to start recognizing the narratives that circulate around this kind of work can be dealt with as, you know, in terms that maybe that are not dissimilar to performance art, or, you know, to find different ways of doing it so that we're not always looking at the means ends relationship as a way of judging it, because that's the most. I mean, that's not why I'm interested in art. You know, if I want that, I'll go and do sociology. You know, I want something more. I want space for a different way of thinking about things.
I'm gonna. Oh my goodness, what is happening? You are literally the furthest away from me.
I apologize. I'm curious. I like that you're talking about criteria for these kinds of acts or discipline or practice, and I'm curious about how you're thinking about timescale, because you mentioned early on what are the impacts of some of these practices or events or models, and so I was curious in terms of timescale, and I'm relating it to sort of the practice of marching or parading against the king, and how that impacted revolts over time. And I guess I'm comparing this practice to relationships of revolutionary moments, kind of like what you see in Egypt or even our own history. So I'm just curious, how do you think about timescale, and how do we think about these practices as they relate to impacts and their successes, or are these part of a longer continuum where you don't see the impact for years and years and years. So I don't know if you thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I want to deflect the question of impact as being not central to what I'm thinking about. And if we start thinking about all of these works in terms of impact, then it opens up a whole new box of stuff about how do we evaluate impact of a work of art. And then this becomes incredibly tedious, statistical, positivist data collection. So instead, in terms of timescale, I mean, it's telling that this stuff that we refer to as projects tends to have a longer timescale, but equally it can be a very short-term, event, but it might have needed months, if not years, of preparation for it. So I don't quite know how to respond to your question, really. Do you have anything to say about timescale?
Well, I think it goes back a bit also to this idea of thinking of these kinds of projects in terms of performance. If you go back to some of the really early writing, like Mapping the Terrain, the Suzanne Lacy essay in there, there's her model of the concentric circles of audience, where she thought very early on, thinking about this kind of work, she was thinking about, the people who imagine or directly participate in conceptualizing the project as one circle, and then the participants who participate in putting the project together as another circle, then the audience who directly experiences the event of the project as another circle, and then the audience of myth and memory as like the final circle.
Yeah.
And her argument was that you actually had to plan for all of those audiences. And that the project was something that unfolded over all of those timescales as well as all of those audiences.
I think I'd agree with that. And I think the better projects are those that do plan for those multiple concentric layers of reception.
We're out of time. I want to thank Claire Bishop, Miriam Ghani, Cooper Union, our phenomenal partner on this. Come back for Brian Hubbs. Thanks for